All right, y'all. Welcome back. We are doing Joe the Barbarian this week by Grant Morrison and Sean Murphy. You'll see that I've got a new PowerPoint layout. It's great. Grant Morrison, great author. Sean Murphy, great artist. Joe the Barbarian, great named character. So let's jump in this. We have Grant Morrison, who's a Scottish-born author, often associated with the British invasion of the late 80s. The British invasion included other writers such as Alan Moore, whose Watchmen we read, Grant Morrison himself, and Neil Gaiman, who did Sandman, Black Orchid, and a bunch of other stuff. If you like this text, if you like the psychological aspects of it, the kind of mythopoetic world-building aspects, you might check out Arkham Asylum. It's a Batman book that came out in 1988, I believe. His Doom Patrol long-running comic that is a live-action show now, I believe. He wrote a book about comics called Super Gods, which is really good. Sean Murphy is one of my favorite artists, I think, and he's American-born. He did Hellraiser, a series called Punk Rock Jesus, The Wake with Scott Snyder, who did a bunch of Batman comics, Tokyo Ghosts, etc. So in case you dig this, you might like other stuff that these two have done as well. Joe the Barbarian was published in 2010 through Vertigo. I talked about that a few weeks ago. It was one of the imprints of DC that's really important to kind of the emergence of a more adult, sophisticated comics that really rode the wave of these the British invasion to take DC comics to kind of new heights. I think Murphy's art is really crisp. It's evocative. We see here, for maybe the first time in the comics we've read, some really experimental panel arrangements that you should notice throughout the book. But one thing Grant Morrison said in 2010 interview is that he compared this text to Home Alone meets Lord of the Rings, which I think is really interesting. Joe is a big fantasy story, but I kind of wanted to reinvent the fantasy genres. We're familiar with it and do something that felt more believable, modern, and convincing to me. And we'll talk about whether this qualifies as fantasy or perhaps it's incorporating other genres as well. I looked at things like Narnia and Lewis Carroll, stories where some kid goes through the mirror or down the staircase into a weird world. What would be the 21st century, post 9/11 version of the quest through the other world? You know, Alice in Wonderland was written for Victorian kids who swept chimneys or lived in cruel orphanages. I wanted to write a book for and about kids today, incorporating all the feelings of loss and the heavy, traumatic atmosphere of a culture in the midst of a distant war. Talking about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It's a story about a 13-year-old boy who journeys from his attic to his basement trying to turn on the electricity, which is a really domestic, kind of easy kind of quest. But that quest is complicated by the fact that Joe's diabetic, and he is suffering from insulin shock or hypoglycemic shock, which they call it in the book, which causes him to hallucinate. In this new realm, Joe is a dying boy who's a messianic figure who, according to some prophecy, is the only person capable of vanquishing King Death, the immortal terror that threatens to envelop the entire kingdom in night. The text is a cooler version, in my opinion, of Toy Story, a domestic hero quest that reveals the trauma of a 13-year-old boy who lost his father. It's also a celebration of imagination and everyday triumphs over adversity. So we think about the quest motif, and here's Smoot saying, it's not that I don't like Joe, but he's hardly the quest hero type, right? Is that the text seems to embrace and reject traditional elements of that quest story. So we might think about medieval romances. We might think about modern incarnations of those romances. We think about Virgil's Aeneid, the Grail quest in Arthurian tradition, in which the other world or journeying to that other world or those other worlds are common motifs. These are typically not just a journey of discovery about the self, but also about the community and one's place within that community, right? So when Odysseus has to travel throughout the Mediterranean, he comes back different. He's learned, he's changed. Same thing when Aeneas goes to found Troy. To found Rome from Troy. So we know from the opening pages that Joe's mother might lose their house, which establishes kind of the terms of the quest. So there's a couple quests going on. One is Joe needs a soda. He needs to turn on the lights. He also knows that he might not have a house anymore. Typically, the protagonist of quest stories has a guide. You might think of Virgil in Dante's Divine Comedy, or something like Jack here. Someone who helps the protagonist and from whom the protagonist learns. I also think Grant Morrison is onto the range of things that are facing millennials and Gen Zers, right? Everything's getting more expensive. We constantly hear about the world dying. It feels like a heroic struggle, sometimes simply to exist in the modern world. The domestic setting, I think, speaks to that and to the ways that people now struggle with local, smaller things. We might also think about Joe's diabetes, which of course isn't his fault, much like the problems facing young people today were not made by them, right? So the quest, rather than being this grand kind of epic quest in the old terms, in the terms from the classical world or the medieval, the early modern periods, this is much more about confining itself to the house. So I encourage you to think about the house and why so much time is spent early establishing the spatial layout of the house and why that might be important to the rest of the text. So I thought to talk about insulin reaction or hypoglycemia just a little bit, and this is where Joe falls down from his really cool bedroom and sees all the toys on the floor. So some of the common things that happen when you go through insulin reaction. So the novel recreates Joe coming in and out of consciousness throughout the disjointed, sometimes confusing narrative, right? So for example, in chapter 5, from never to always, Joe asks, "What just happened?" And Jack responds, "It's still miles below us, and that's pretty much the only reason we haven't hit the ground yet." So this is a meta moment where Joe kind of slips in and out of reality and back into his hallucinatory world. And I think this is the novel acknowledging its own kind of storytelling gaps, which I think is intended to help us understand Joe's mental and physical states, right? Where his hallucinations, the fact that he kind of moves between consciousness and hallucination, the way that the text deals with that sometimes is its disjointed kind of narrative structure. So you'll see from the insulin reactions that hallucinations, as far as I can tell, aren't necessarily a typical kind of phenomenal response to this, but I'm no expert, so perhaps it is. If somebody in the audience is, let me know. We might also think about this in terms of speculative fiction. We talked about speculative fiction in terms of Watchmen. It's a general umbrella term for anything non-realist, for sci-fi, horror, fantasy, etc. It is speculative because it posits possibilities that are distinct from our world. Here we might think of Watchmen, which looks at our world, well, the 1986 version of it at least, but which has fundamental differences that distinguish it from ours, right? There's free energy, there's Dr. Manhattan, there's the fact that the U.S. definitively wins the Vietnam War. Those differences are the speculative part of the Watchmen as speculative. It allows the authors to ask, what if these things were different? How would the world work with these differences? That, in turn, allows the speculative fiction to comment on our world. And we might think about how Joe the Barbarian does that too, right? In domesticating the quest narrative or whatever it is that it does in your view. And I'm getting crazy with PowerPoint. Boom. Magical realism. It's magical. From Wendy Ferris's Shahrazada's Children. I said that wrong, of course. We've had a lot of talk about magical realism in terms of displacement. So I thought it might be useful to really chase that down and see what that means. And there's, according to Wendy Ferris, who's a scholar, there are 5 elements of magical realism, that the text contains an irreducible element of magic that's something we can't explain through the phenomenal world, right, or through reality. And Joe seems clearly to be suffering from insulin shock, but there's also some aspects of the text that aren't fully explainable through that. The second one is what Salman Rushdie once called a profusion of detail, that there's so much detail about the world that is one of the things that distinguishes magical realism from simply fantasy, is that we get details and realistic descriptions of things in that world that aren't necessarily markers of fantasy. Third, that the reader may hesitate between 2 contradictory understandings of events. I think that's something we definitely see here. The other world offers kind of explanations for Joe's quests that are different from what happens in the real world. We experience the closeness or near merging of worlds, right? We see that about the life-death, the real imaginary, whether he's awake or in a dream. You know, he kind of time travels when he finds his father's letter. There's all sorts of ways in which boundaries between different parts of experience are challenged here. And then finally, these fictions question received ideas about time, space, and identity. As part of their speculative nature is that they ask, might time or space or identity function differently, right? And we see that as Jack becomes, you know, a samurai, awesome warrior, et cetera, et cetera. But we might think about more so than, you know, if you choose to write about this, one thing I'd ask you not to do is not to say Joe the Barbarian is magical realism and here's why, because that doesn't really give us anything more to talk about with Joe the Barbarian. We might think about which characteristics it has, which does it lack, which other genres we see at work here, And much more importantly, if you decide to write about this, how does thinking of Joe the Barbarian as magical realism or as a comedy or whatever help us to understand it better or differently? I hope that makes sense. Is it a comedy, for example? And you'll see on the right a picture of Princess Bride, which is, of course, the greatest rom-com ever produced. Comedy as a genre is about the separation and reunion of a family. The happy ending is typical of that reunion, right? And we think of comedy as being funny, being lighthearted, and that's really keyed into the fact that there's a happy ending and distinguishes it from tragedy, especially in the tradition of Aristotle. So we might think about the 20th and 21st century rom-com as an example, and the broad contours of that genre are that the couple finds each other, but they're like so different, right? So they can't really be together. They're driven apart by some kind of machinations of someone else, or some twist of fate drives them apart, but they get back together at the end, right? And we can see that structure in almost every comedy, almost every rom-com. Is that what this story is about? Does it have elements of comedy? Because there does seem to be a happy resolution at the end. There's sort of a reunion of sorts with Joe's father. So, these are all things you might think through and ask. So the questions that we have for this week are about genre, art, influence, close reading, trauma, and meta-commentary. So how might you categorize Joe the Barbarian? If you choose this one, do include a definition that you either find online or preferably through some sort of peer-reviewed journal article, and why. Do you think it's important that we think about it in terms of a genre? Again, do not say, I think this is fantasy and here's why. I think this is fantasy and here's why it's important for our understanding of some aspect of the text would be a much better way to go about that. As far as the artistic style, how does that contribute to the novel, right? It spends several early pages establishing the layout of the house. Why is that important? Why is the way that that Murphy renders characters important? Why does it use certain full-page spreads and not those at other points? Do we see, for the third question, any influence from other texts we've read? I chose this text partly because I see it as a really playful kind of take on the superhero genre, the heroic genres that we see commonly throughout comics, and a really imaginative and interesting take on that. But there are definitely kind of callbacks, I think, to particular moments in Watchmen. Like there's a moment where there's the butterflies, and that reminds me of Ozymandias's Karnak, for example. Another option, which I hope will be popular, is just to offer a really detailed, close reading of a particular page or panel. But you need to do this in order to say why it's important. So your basic argument here is this panel or this page that I'm close reading is really important to some larger theme or larger concern of the text, and that would be perfectly reasonable to do for here. So you might pick the closing image, for example. Why is that important? The trauma thing seems to be a through line for many of the texts in this course, and indeed many of the more kind of identity-based comics that are popular in comics right now. So how does this text investigate trauma? Why is it a motivator? How does it kind of work? You might think about this in terms of genre or differently. And then finally, is this a kind of meta-commentary? Because like Displacement, we have a protagonist who is an artist, right? A visual artist. And how might that be important? Why is it important that he's a visual artist? And it seems like these hallucinations are super imaginative. And many of the things that populate his imagination are superheroes, right? He even says that, like, oh, we've got superheroes on our side in this battle and we're losing. Are more, and Murphy, I said more, but this obviously means, sorry about that. This should say Grant Morrison, Murphy making some sort of comments about creating comics, about imagination, about how art might function. I'll fix that before I put this up online, but hopefully this is useful, and let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoyed the text. Thanks.